In May of 2009, 48-year-old Rodrigo Rosenberg was at the peak of his career as one of Guatemala's most prominent lawyers. Tall, handsome, and charismatic, Rodrigo had law degrees from both Cambridge University and Harvard University, and he was the co-founder of a very successful corporate law office in Guatemala City, the country's capital. And while it was obvious that Rodrigo had worked very hard for all of the nice things he had, like his luxury Mercedes-Benz car, in reality, he didn't really have to work for a living. Rodrigo had been born into privilege. There was wealth on both sides of his family. His mother had brought a large inheritance to her marriage, and his father had built a massive business empire that included a chain of movie cinemas. When Rodrigo stepped out of his office building in downtown Guatemala City to meet a client for lunch at one of the upscale restaurants tucked away in the capital's maze of boutiques and little markets, he looked exactly like what he was, a member, like his parents before him, of the Guatemalan oligarchy, a small group of rich, upper-class conservative Guatemalans who had connections and influence in government and business. He always wore a dark, perfectly tailored suit, an immaculate white shirt, and a pale blue tie, an expensive uniform that set off his dark features and the ring of black hair cut short around the crown of his bald head. And when Rodrigo talked to his client in one of those hacienda-style eateries with red clay-tiled roofs and cool stucco interiors that he especially favored, it wouldn't be long before his client, like all of Rodrigo's clients, realized that it wasn't just the money or influence that drove Rodrigo. Like his friends and associates like to say, Rodrigo had a strong sense of purpose as well as ambition, and a very strong sense of right and wrong. He had chosen a career in law because he liked the clarity of the law. If it was practiced fairly, he felt like it was the best way of settling disagreements and disputes. But the thing that really made Rodrigo stand out in this Central American country of 16 million people was not just his brilliance and his drive, it was the fact that he had a reputation for absolute honesty. Because Guatemala was a country best known in the world for its incredible levels of corruption and violence. Even though 36 years of civil war between authoritarian rulers and leftist guerrillas had ended back in 1994, that conflict had left more than 200,000 people, many of them civilians, dead, and another 45,000 people, quote, disappeared, which meant either killed or kidnapped, mostly the work of government forces or right-wing paramilitary groups. But after the 1994 peace agreement was signed, most of the people in Guatemala who had committed the murders and rapes and other widespread human rights violations that took place during the Civil War were never prosecuted or called to account for their crimes. Instead, in the post-Civil War Guatemala, these should-be war criminals simply turned to new careers, such as participating in organized crime, becoming assassins for hire, or getting in on the very lucrative Central and South American drug trade. And 15 years later, even though Guatemala had a democratically elected civilian president who had promised to root out crime and government corruption, these criminals and their criminal networks had still been able to reach their tentacles into almost every government and law enforcement agency, and nearly half the country wasn't under any government control at all. By 2009, Guatemala had the third highest murder rate of any country in the world, averaging more than 123 homicides every week, and 97% of those murders went unsolved. And the few cases that did go to trial often ended with the alleged killers going free after judges or prosecutors or witnesses were bribed, threatened, or even murdered. So in this sea of corruption, where everyone with power seemed to have dirt on their hands, Rodrigo stood out for his willingness to shamelessly call out criminal behavior wherever he saw it. So to anyone who knew Rodrigo, it didn't come as any surprise when he wasn't just horrified when one of his very own clients was assassinated in broad daylight. He was absolutely furious, especially since this particular client, Musa Khalil, had a reputation for being a very ethical businessman who treated his workers fairly. Since arriving in Guatemala from Lebanon when he was just a young man, 76-year-old Musa had worked his way up from poverty to become a successful coffee producer and textile manufacturer. Although Rodrigo was not personally close to Musa, Rodrigo admired and respected the older man because the man refused to steal from the state or make payoffs to get favorable deals on his coffee or manufacturing companies. Musa was a straight shooter, just like Rodrigo. The assassination took place in Guatemala City on April 14, 2009, as Musa and his 37-year-old daughter Marjorie were waiting in their car at a traffic light while on their way to lunch. According to eyewitnesses, a car pulled up quickly behind them and a man hopped out and approached the front passenger seat of the Khalil's car where Musa was sitting. Musa and his daughter likely assumed that this man just wanted to ask them a question, but as soon as this man reached their car window, he pulled out a 9mm pistol and he fired 9 shots into Musa's head and torso. By the time the police arrived, the gunman had fled the scene on the back of a motorcycle driven by an accomplice, and Musa, along with his daughter, were both dead. It would turn out one of those 9 bullets that were fired at Musa had passed right through his body and struck and killed his daughter. She was not the intended target, she was just collateral damage. On the day of the murders, right after Rodrigo had found out about them, he contacted his 24-year-old son, Eduardo, who was also a lawyer at Rodrigo's law firm, and told him to meet him at the crime scene. When Eduardo arrived, he found his father pacing back and forth in front of the yellow crime scene tape, demanding answers from the police who had converged on the scene along with medical personnel. Turning to his approaching son, Rodrigo swept his arms out to either side in a gesture of helplessness and frustration that took in the whole chaotic scene in front of them. There was also an expression of shock and sadness on his father's face that Eduardo didn't see very often. You couldn't live in Guatemala without feeling like violence, even murder, was just business as usual. But Eduardo also understood that there was something different about this crime, something that made it stand out, especially to members of the city's wealthy upper class, because, like them, Musa and his whole family were people with power and influence. They had personal ties with people inside the administration of Guatemala's president, Alvaro Colom. If Musa could be gunned down in cold blood in the middle of the day, others among the Guatemalan elite worried that the same thing could happen to them too. Before leaving the crime scene, Rodrigo told his son in a bitter voice that the police, like always, would probably never find and prosecute the people who killed Musa and Marjorie. And even if they did, they'd never be able to touch whoever it was that had organized the assassination in the first place. It didn't take long for Rodrigo's prediction to come true. Even though thousands of people turned out for the funeral service of Musa and his daughter, including President Colom's powerful private secretary, police made absolutely no progress on tracking down the killers, and it wasn't long before the murders just seemed like all the others in Guatemala, just numbers on a stat sheet. Except this time, Rodrigo had had enough. Musa had been a good man, and his innocent daughter, Marjorie, had left behind a husband and 2 children. And so if the police were not going to catch their killers, then Rodrigo would. Rodrigo told his son that one way or another, he was going to get to the bottom of this and figure out exactly who did it and why. But almost as soon as he got started asking questions, Rodrigo noticed that even by Guatemalan standards, the police seemed to have gathered virtually no information outside of taking the obligatory statements from witnesses who saw the assassination and asking Musa's family if he had had any business or money troubles. And as Rodrigo began calling some of his contacts within the government about the police investigation, he began to wonder whether there was an active attempt going on inside President Colom's circle of advisors to cover up some connection that the government itself might have to the assassination. So just a few days after Musa's funeral, Rodrigo turned to another one of his clients, a man named Luis Mendizabal, who was also a close friend of Rodrigo's. After calling Luis to arrange a visit, Rodrigo slipped out of his law office and drove to the exclusive men's clothing store that Luis owned in one of the capital's most fashionable districts. But the fitting and sale of handmade suits was just part of the business that Luis operated out of that storefront. To those who knew him well, they knew that Luis's real skill was in the collection of secrets and information. With his flowing white hair and trim mustache and his easy banter about his family and his grandchildren, Luis did not look the part of a spy. But as he measured and cut fabric and chatted with a wealthy clientele that included criminals, businessmen, military, police, and government bureaucrats, Luis gathered huge amounts of insider intel on what was going on in their country. And so if there was anyone who could help Rodrigo find out who killed Musa and Marjorie, it was Luis. Rodrigo's hunch paid off. Before long, Luis had come up with a possible lead in the Musa murder case. A few months before the assassination at the very beginning of 2009, Musa had been nominated to serve on the board of directors for two institutions that both had ties to something called the Rural Development Bank, or the Ban Rural. The Ban Rural was the major funding source for the president's popular social programs, and these two institutions that had invited Musa to join them were engaged in a power struggle over which one of them would control the bank. But since rumors of sketchy financial dealings were already swirling around Ban Rural, when Musa was offered these two board positions, Rodrigo had actually advised him not to accept either of them. However, Rodrigo had no idea what Musa's final decision had been. Luis suspected that Musa, as he began to do his own research on these two institutions, had uncovered that one or both of them were engaged in financial mismanagement. More conversations with Musa's family seemed to confirm this theory. One of Musa's surviving daughters told Rodrigo that her father had received threatening letters from officials on the two boards, and that Musa had apparently written back to them saying, "You can't tell me what to do, and I will protect myself from my enemies." During the 3 weeks that followed Musa's assassination, Eduardo saw less and less of his father, who was spending more and more of his time on his own private investigation into these murders. It seemed to everyone who knew Rodrigo that his outrage over the murders had turned into an unhealthy obsession. Rodrigo basically stopped going in to the law office or returning calls to his regular clients, and instead just stayed home in his apartment where he lived alone to pore over his notes on the murders. And when Eduardo did meet his father for lunch or for dinner, Rodrigo barely touched his food, and all he wanted to talk about was his theory that Musa had somehow become the target of a conspiracy at the highest levels of government. His father, who had been an avid cyclist, had completely stopped going on his morning bike rides. He'd lost weight, his perfectly tailored suits hung on him just loosely enough that he looked disheveled, and his eyes never stopped moving, constantly checking his phone for calls and messages, and showing no interest at all about how things were going back at the office. Eduardo knew that both his parents were still struggling after having separated the year before. Rodrigo's own father had abandoned his family when Rodrigo was very young, and Rodrigo had never forgiven him, even refusing to accept the inheritance his father had left for him. So after Rodrigo's separation, when his estranged wife moved to neighboring Mexico with their 4 children, Rodrigo was crushed. He felt like he had abandoned his own family. Looking at his father now, Eduardo worried that any progress his father might have made in adjusting to his new situation and moving on with his personal life was now being completely consumed by this private murder investigation. It was obvious to Eduardo that this investigation had become more than just finding the killers. It was about trying to actually stop corruption at the heart of Guatemala's politics. And in early May of that year, Rodrigo suddenly knew, without a doubt, that all that digging and all the documents he was putting together about corruption at Ban Rural, all the names and dates of meetings, the involvement of President Colom and his wife, all of it was finally getting him closer to the people who had murdered his client. For weeks, he'd had the feeling that he was being followed, that everywhere he went outside of his apartment, someone was watching him. But now he had proof. Because now Rodrigo, like Musa, had started receiving threats. Except his threats were phone calls, not letters. The first call came on May 5th. It only lasted long enough for the caller to tell Rodrigo to stop his investigation into the murders. After that, the calls came once a day with the same message. And even though Rodrigo couldn't recognize the deliberately distorted voice on the other end of the line, he started to suspect that the threats were coming directly from within President Colom's inner circle, from Colom's private secretary himself, a man named Gustavo Alejos, who actually had an office directly across from the apartment where Rodrigo lived. Not only was Gustavo an influential advisor to the president, his brother was the head of the Guatemalan Congress. After these threatening calls started coming in, Rodrigo, who was far more excited at this development than afraid, called his spy friend Luis to tell him about how he thought Gustavo Alejos was the caller. Rodrigo also asked Luis to write down the unknown telephone number that belonged to this threatening caller. Even though he didn't say it explicitly, it was clear to Luis that he was being told to take this number down in case something happened to Rodrigo. After the two friends hung up, Luis felt very concerned. He felt like Rodrigo was aware of the danger he was in, but wasn't fully appreciating it. And so on May 8th, after Rodrigo met Luis at his clothing shop, Luis quickly pulled his friend into a back room, and once the door was shut and they were alone, Luis told Rodrigo in a hushed tone that not only should he stop his investigation into the murders, but that he should flee Guatemala altogether. Clearly, his life was in danger given the threatening phone calls he was getting, but Rodrigo said he could not stop now. He knew he was close to getting the name of Musa's killer and solid proof that the government had been involved in the assassination. He also told Luis, as a way of reassuring him, that once he had all the evidence he needed, he was not about to go to the Guatemalan police, who very well could have even played a role in the murders. Instead, he planned to present his findings to the powerful and high-profile International Criminal Court that is seated in The Hague in the Netherlands. The ICC is known around the world for trying cases that involve genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and aggression, and for trying criminals like the ones in Guatemala who all received immunity from the Guatemalan government at the end of the Guatemalan Civil War. By going directly to The Hague, Rodrigo would finally be taking action against a system of government corruption that had, in the words of one of his friends, been eating at his guts for years. However, before he could go any further with this case, Rodrigo told Luis, as they sat in the back of Luis's shop, that there was one very specific thing that Rodrigo still had to do, and in order to do it, he needed Luis's help. It was a favor, and it was an insurance policy that no matter what happened in any court of law, the information that Rodrigo had uncovered was guaranteed to become public knowledge. Reluctantly, Luis agreed, and after discussing the details, they arranged to meet again the next day. As Rodrigo left the store, Luis had a bad feeling. He was certain that whatever the outcome of Rodrigo's plan, it was sure to bring a lot of pain to his family and to his friends. 2 days later, on Sunday, May 10th, at 8 o'clock in the morning, Rodrigo stepped into one of the bedrooms of his trendy luxury apartment in the Zona 1 neighborhood of Guatemala City. Glancing out the window, he could see the faint outlines of the mountains that ringed the capital. But his mind was on other things. Luis had been as good as his word and had helped Rodrigo put together the final pieces of the case that he had been building one fact at a time against the Guatemalan government. His bodyguard, who also served as his driver, had also been willing to help, running a couple of errands the week before that Rodrigo had not been able to see to himself, including taking Rodrigo's bike in for a tune-up. It had been more than a month since Rodrigo had done any serious cycling, but the night before, he'd made up his mind that this morning he was going to go out and go for a ride, even if it was just a short one. He was lucky with the day's weather. May was one of Guatemala's rainiest months, but that morning was dry and the sun was breaking through the clouds. Rodrigo pulled on his navy blue bike shorts and blue short-sleeved top and laced up his white sneakers. Leaving his bedroom, he checked the gold watch on his left wrist and then walked toward the front door, pausing long enough to grab the red and white mountain bike that was leaning against the wall in the front hallway. He wheeled his bike to the elevator, and a minute later, he was pushing the bike out of the apartment complex onto the sidewalk that led to the main street that ran left to right in front of the building. Once Rodrigo made it to the edge of this main road, he looked both ways along the road to see if any cars were coming, and as he did that, the sun broke through and suddenly lit up the grass and trees along either side of the street. Just before getting on his bike, Rodrigo checked to make sure his iPod was queued up to his favorite band, Santana. He hit play, and then he pushed his bike off the curb into the road. He turned right, then hopped on his bike and began pedaling down the street. After only a few hundred yards, Rodrigo turned right again off of the main road onto a service road. The sun reflected off the windows of a brown and white high-rise apartment just ahead of him on the left. Minutes later, Rodrigo noticed a man running across the street in front of him from the left to the right, and at first, Rodrigo thought it was a jogger. But then he noticed this man was wearing jeans and a dark jacket with a high collar. The running man, after he crossed the street and was on the right side, he slowed and then looked intently at Rodrigo, and for a second, their eyes met. And then this man with the jeans and the jacket began running at full speed towards Rodrigo. Okay, back to the story. Before Rodrigo could do anything except make a final erratic swerve to the right that took his bike right to the edge of the curb, the man had closed the distance between them, reached into the waistband of his jeans, and pulled out a gun. Rodrigo felt the thud of the first 3 bullets and heard the loud crack of each shot. His bike clattered to the pavement as he fell backward over the curb until he was half laying in the grassy median. By the time the second 2 bullets shattered Rodrigo's jaw and forehead, Rodrigo was dead. A few seconds later, nearby residents heard the sound of a car gunning its engine and roaring off into the distance. Within minutes, those same residents of the Zona 1 neighborhood were on their phones, making frantic calls to 911 to report the sound of gunfire. Police were on the scene almost immediately. On his way to Rodrigo's apartment, Rodrigo's bodyguard heard the sirens and saw the police cars that were blocking the service road near his employer's apartment. He slowed down, and as police started setting up a perimeter, he thought he caught a glimpse of a red and white bike on the pavement. He parked his car at the top of the service road, and as he jumped out and headed towards the knot of police and emergency personnel, he pulled out his phone and called Rodrigo's son, Eduardo, because by now, the bodyguard could clearly see that the body sprawled on the edge of the service road near that red and white bike belonged to his employer. Rodrigo's bodyguard had known what Rodrigo was working on. He'd even run some errands that he'd suspected were related to the case his boss was investigating. He'd warned Rodrigo to be careful. He wished now that he had insisted on staying over last night and accompanying Rodrigo on this bike ride. A few minutes later, Eduardo, as well as his father's friend, Luis, showed up at the crime scene. Ashen-faced, Eduardo identified himself as Rodrigo's son, but before he and Luis had time to process what they were seeing, they were both approached by Guatemala police officers who were eager to start gathering information about what had happened. Right as the 2 men stepped back away from the carnage in front of them, Eduardo noticed his father was wearing a wedding ring on his finger again. And instantly when he saw that, Eduardo recalled a secret his father had told him right around the time Musa and Marjorie had been killed. And as he thought of this secret, Eduardo felt an unexpected rush of grief come over him, and his eyes started to fill with tears. He felt so sorry for his father, and he just hoped that the police would be able to find his killer and bring them to justice. But before the police could really even begin their investigation, something happened that would push the Guatemalan government to the edge of total collapse. On May 12th, 2 days after Rodrigo's murder, hundreds of people crowded into a church to attend Rodrigo's funeral service. The pews were filled wall to wall with his family, friends, clients, government officials, business leaders, and the fashionably dressed members of the capital's wealthy oligarchy. Right after Eduardo had delivered his father's eulogy, Rodrigo's friend, Luis, stepped forward and addressed the mourners, who looked like a who's who of the Guatemalan elite. Taking a deep breath, Luis said to the crowd that he knew they were all asking themselves the same question. Why would anyone want to kill Rodrigo Rosenberg? Then Luis held up his hand, showing the crowd a case that contained a DVD. This, he said, contained the answer to that question. Once the surprised and excited murmurs quieted down, Luis went on to say that Rodrigo had left instructions that if he was murdered, then Luis should go public with the 18-minute-long video that he now held in his hand. Luis, who said that he himself had only seen the video after his friend's death, invited anyone in the crowd interested to take a copy of the DVD with them when they left. One of the mourners who took Luis up on that offer was a government minister who immediately called President Colom's personal secretary, Gustavo Alejos, to tell him what had just happened. A few minutes later, the minister slipped out of the church and drove straight to the National Palace in the center of Guatemala City, where President Colom lived with his wife. As President Colom, along with his vice president and closest advisors, gathered in the president's office, an aide slipped the disc into the president's computer and then hit play. A second later, they were all staring at an image of Rodrigo sitting alone behind a table with a blue screen behind him. He was wearing his usual navy blue suit, pressed white shirt, light blue tie, and wedding ring. In front of him was a microphone. There was nothing professional or polished about the production of the video that filled the computer screen in front of the president and his aides. And for some reason, that made the message that Rodrigo delivered even more believable and chilling. After stating his name for the record, Rodrigo wasted no time dropping the bombshell that would soon be heard all over the world, as the 18-minute-long video was uploaded to YouTube, where it would go viral under the simple title, YouTube Murder. On the video, Rodrigo very calmly states, "If you are seeing or hearing this message, it means that I've been murdered by President Alvaro Colom with the help of his personal secretary, Gustavo Alejos." Rodrigo would also blame the president, his wife, and Gustavo Alejos for the assassination of Musa Khalil and his daughter. Rodrigo stated that they were killed because Musa's involvement with the Rural Development Bank, Ban Rural, had put him in a position to reveal the president and first lady's abuse and misappropriation of Ban Rural funds. Rodrigo said the president's motive for killing him, Rodrigo, was because Rodrigo had direct knowledge of the conspiracy to kill Musa, and that Rodrigo also had proof that the president and first lady were using Ban Rural to embezzle and launder millions of dollars. Rodrigo warned Guatemalans against believing the smear campaign and cover-ups that would greet these accusations, ending with a plea to all Guatemalans that it was time for massive government reform. And the first step was to get rid of President Colom and replace him with the vice president, who was not a thief or assassin, and whose duty it would be to bring the rule of law back to Guatemala. Rodrigo's video would have a massive ripple effect. Within hours of its upload to YouTube, Guatemala was plunged into a sudden and totally unexpected political crisis. The people of Guatemala, for the most part, believed what Rodrigo was saying. Even some of the president's own advisors wondered if the accusations were true. The president's initial reaction was not to respond to the accusations himself, but rather to send two of his aides out to publicly dismiss the video as a fake. However, this would have the opposite effect. And so that night, under lots of mounting pressure, President Colom went on national TV to deny the accusations himself. However, he looked more scared and nervous than convincing. Meanwhile, so many people from all over the world were watching this video that YouTube servers started to crash, and protesters wearing white shirts to symbolize their demand for a clean government started to flood the streets of Guatemala's capital city. Alvaro Colom knew before the end of that Tuesday, May 12th, that his presidency was hanging on by just a thread. So when protesters and the Guatemalan elite demanded that a United Nations-backed agency, rather than the Guatemalan police, handle the investigation into Rodrigo's death, the president knew he had to agree. By the next morning, May 13th, the whole investigation was in the hands of an international commission called the CICIG. This organization had been created by the United Nations in 2007 to investigate specific cases of systemic violence and corruption. And under the direction of Spanish Judge Carlos Castrosana, who took up residence in Guatemala City, an international group of investigators did what Guatemalan police either couldn't do or wouldn't do. They began relentlessly drilling down into who was behind the assassination of Rodrigo Rosenberg. The first break in the case happened almost immediately. Whoever had organized the hit on Rodrigo had chosen one of the most heavily videotaped neighborhoods in Guatemala. While investigators couldn't find a reliable eyewitness to the crime, footage gathered from dozens of security cameras near Rodrigo's apartment had captured almost the entire assassination on camera. Almost immediately after getting onto his bicycle at 8:05 a.m., Rodrigo was followed by a black late-model Mazda. Security cameras also caught clear enough images of that black getaway car that investigators were eventually able to track down the car and then its owner. And when they examined the car owner's phone records and location data, investigators were able to place him and several calls he made on the day of the murder at or near the crime scene. Investigators immediately set up a wiretap operation on the car owner, and for the next 4 months, they listened in on his conversations, and quickly, they discovered that he was part of a criminal gang made up of 10 men, most of them former national police officers. Meanwhile, using the CI/CIG powers, Judge Castrosana started identifying and arresting corrupt members of the Guatemalan government. And as Rodrigo had predicted in his 18-minute video, investigators were up against a disinformation campaign organized by the president or his top advisors aimed at interfering with the investigation and smearing the vice president, the man Rodrigo had tapped as Colom's successor. But it wasn't until September, 4 months after Rodrigo was killed, that Judge Castrosana got the breakthrough he was looking for. After a massive raid on 10 different locations throughout Guatemala, investigators arrested all 10 members of the criminal gang whose phones investigators had been tapping. Once in custody, it didn't take long for members of this gang to start giving up information in exchange for lighter sentences. And so quickly, investigators were able to start to piece together how the murder was carried out, except they were missing a crucial piece of information. The 10-person gang clearly didn't know Rodrigo. They were just following orders to have him killed. But what the investigators couldn't figure out was who gave them that order. Who was the person behind the scenes making this assassination happen? Judge Castrosana and his team believed this person was an inside man, someone who had been close enough to Rodrigo, who had not ridden his bike in over a month, to know that Rodrigo had chosen that morning to go for a bike ride down that service road. But it wouldn't be until investigators tracked down a small piece of paper with a faded signature on it that the so-called inside man would be revealed. Based on all the information investigators found, this is a reconstruction of what really happened to Rodrigo Rosenberg. On Friday, May 1st, 16 days after the murder of Musa and his daughter Marjorie, and 9 days before Rodrigo's murder, the inside man, who would mastermind Rodrigo's assassination, contacted one of his most trusted lieutenants. He told him to go buy 2 prepaid mobile phones. He told the man to pay cash and warned him not to sign his name on any paperwork or sales receipt. The lieutenant did as he was told and dropped both phones along with the sales receipt off at the office of the inside man. By this point, the inside man had already arranged the hit on Rodrigo. He had reached out to 2 men who were actually close friends and relatives of Rodrigo, 2 powerful brothers who owned one of the biggest pharmaceutical companies in Guatemala. The inside man had told them that he needed their help arranging a hit on a man he described as a, quote, extortionist. The brothers said they knew of a criminal gang that would probably do the hit for about $40,000. The 3 men settled the details. The brothers told the inside man that they would contact the hitmen and arrange the payment, along with the delivery of a burner phone that the hitmen would use to communicate with the inside man. The inside man set the murder date for Sunday, May 10th, and told the hitman that he would be in touch with them before that day with a detailed physical description of their target, along with information on where and when they should actually commit the murder. Then, starting on Monday, May 4th, the inside man used the second prepaid cell phone to start calling Rodrigo's personal cell phone. He called Rodrigo at least once a day for the next 5 days, speaking only long enough to make a single threat, telling the lawyer to stop investigating the assassination of Musa Khalil. On May 9th, 1 day before Rodrigo's murder, the inside man called the hitmen to tell them that Rodrigo would be on a bike and would be most vulnerable shortly after leaving his apartment when he turned onto a nearby service road. The next day, shortly before 8 a.m., the 2 hitmen sitting outside Rodrigo's apartment in the black Mazda with tinted windows heard their phone buzz. The driver took the call and turned on the speakerphone, and then they heard the sound of the inside man's voice. The shooter sat up and listened while he double-checked that his 9mm pistol was loaded. The voice on the phone was low and calm. Their target, he told them, was a tall, thin man dressed in navy shorts, a light blue top, and white sneakers. He would be leaving the apartment building at about 8:05 a.m. He'd be riding a red and white mountain bike. He told them to follow Rodrigo onto that service road and then ambush him there. He told them to approach Rodrigo from behind and shoot him in the back, and then once he was down, fire at least 4 more shots into Rodrigo's neck, up into his jaw, and a final shot into his forehead. The inside man told the hitmen to be sure they destroyed the cell phone he had given them, along with its SIM card, once the assassination was complete. The hitmen said they understood, and they hung up. At the same time, Rodrigo was standing in one of his bedrooms in his apartment looking out the window, and then a couple of seconds later, he turned around and went into the kitchen where he made sure his coffee maker was turned off. Then he collected his bike from the hallway. Pushing his bike next to him, he headed to the apartment elevator and punched the button for the ground floor, where he exited the building. Once outside, Rodrigo made his way towards the main street, taking a few seconds to enjoy the cool temperatures and the sudden sunshine that was pouring through a break in the clouds. Then he queued up a song by Santana on his iPod, and despite feeling a little rusty and stiff, he hopped onto his bike, he turned right, and he began heading down the main street. After a few hundred yards, he turned onto the service road. When he saw the man in jeans and the dark jacket running towards him, he tensed up, but only for a second. Then he quickly turned his bike towards the side of the road, where he jammed on his brakes, coming to a complete and sudden stop. Then he got off of his bike, dropping it onto the pavement in front of him, and then he sat down on the curb with his back to the man running toward him. A moment later, Rodrigo would have felt the first bullet hit him in the back. Before he could even absorb the punch or feel any pain, he felt the next 4 bullets hit. 1 in his cheek, 1 in his neck, 1 just below his jaw, and finally, with the killer standing right in front of him, another round into his forehead, knocking his upper body backward onto the grassy median. Seconds later, residents of the apartments in Zona 1 called the police. It would turn out the inside man, the person responsible for Rodrigo's assassination, was Rodrigo himself. He had been devastated by the assassination not only of his client Musa, but of Musa's daughter Marjorie. As Rodrigo had secretly told his son Eduardo and his friend Luis, Rodrigo was deeply in love with Marjorie, and they were planning to get married as soon as Marjorie divorced her husband. The wedding ring that Rodrigo had been wearing at the time of his death, and when he was seen on camera in the YouTube murder video, had been a gift from Marjorie just before she was killed. The raw grief Rodrigo felt over the senseless killing of the woman he loved, along with his absolute conviction that the hit on Musa had been planned by a corrupt president, his wife, and personal secretary, had combined to create a feeling of total hopelessness in Rodrigo's head. At some point early in Rodrigo's investigation into Musa's assassination, Rodrigo realized that even if he could prove his allegations of corruption against the government, there was no way that anyone that high up in government would ever be charged or punished for their crimes. So early in May, Rodrigo, crushed by despair, came up with a plan that would both end his own personal misery and, he hoped, would set Guatemala on the road to real reform. It would be a suicide dressed up to look like an assassination, and with the video he planned to make before his death, Rodrigo hoped that his staged assassination would result in a bloodless coup that would take down the presidency of Alvaro Colom. So it was Rodrigo who had contacted his wife's cousins, the owners of the giant pharmaceutical company, and told them that he wanted to arrange a hit on an extortionist, a man, he told them, who had been after Rodrigo for money. His cousins had agreed, never once suspecting that the extortionist was actually Rodrigo himself. And the trusted lieutenant that Rodrigo had asked to go buy the 2 prepaid cell phones, that was Rodrigo's trusted bodyguard/driver. Rodrigo had made sure one of those 2 prepaid phones was delivered to the hitmen, and he used the other phone to make threatening calls to his own personal cell phone, and to give his killers his own personal description and to tell them exactly when and where they could find and kill him. And so on the morning of his own death, when Rodrigo saw the man in jeans and a jacket running toward him, he knew it was his killer. So he just pulled over, sat on the curb, and waited to be killed. As for the 18-minute-long YouTube murder video, the insurance policy that guaranteed Rodrigo's allegations of corruption could not be swept under the rug, that was produced by Guatemala's top spy and Rodrigo's friend, Luis, with the help of one of Luis's contacts in Guatemala's right-wing press. Although he eventually admitted his hand in making the video, Luis claimed he had no idea that Rodrigo was planning his own assassination. It is possible that Rodrigo's identity as the inside man might have gone undiscovered, except for the security footage that led investigators to the owner of that black Mazda, and the fact that Rodrigo's bodyguard made a critical mistake that linked the prepaid cell phones to his boss. When the bodyguard purchased those two burner phones, he did what Rodrigo said not to. He signed his name on one of the sales tax slips and submitted that slip of paper with his faded signature on it to a secretary at Rodrigo's law office. Even though Rodrigo's videotaped allegations of widespread government corruption were true and resulted in the CICIG removing hundreds of corrupt government officials from their jobs, it would turn out Musa Khalil's assassination and the unintended murder of his daughter Marjorie were not the work of Guatemalan government officials. Just as Guatemala's one honest lawyer was prepared to stage an assassination that could send his own cousins to prison, apparently the honest and incorruptible Musa was buying contraband from criminal networks for use in his textile factory. When Musa refused to pay those suppliers, they had him killed. Once Judge Castrosana released his findings and named Rodrigo as his own killer, the CICIG and government brought charges against Rodrigo's cousins, as well as the 10 members of the criminal gang that helped facilitate the hit. As for President Colom, the YouTube murder video scandal would end up actually strengthening his presidency. His decision to turn over the investigation into Rodrigo's death to a third party, the CICIG, and wait for their report, gave him the public appearance of being a calm and confident leader. In January of 1997, a very accomplished and Ivy League-trained American chemist named Karen Wetterhahn started experiencing tingling in her lower extremities. Now, it was uncomfortable, but it wasn't enough discomfort to warrant going to a doctor or really being concerned about it. She figured it was just something kind of minor and it would go away on its own. But shortly after this tingling began, Karen started noticing she was having balance issues. She would be walking down the hallway at the university where she worked when inexplicably she would just lose her balance and start stumbling and would either fall to the ground or would have to lean up against the wall to steady herself. She tried to convince herself that she was just being clumsy or that she was just really tired and that's what was causing it. But shortly after these balance issues presented themselves, Karen was hit with a host of other health issues. Her speech became awkwardly slow and slurred. She began hearing this white noise ringing in her ear that just wouldn't go away. And her field of vision drastically narrowed to the point where it was like she was looking through 2 toilet paper rolls. Karen's husband brought her to the hospital where she underwent this very lengthy and involved examination, which involved spinal taps and brain scans to try to figure out what was going on because at first, none of the doctors had any idea. After the testing was complete and Karen was sleeping in a hospital bed and her husband was sitting by her side, a doctor walked into the room with a clipboard and he had this odd look on his face, like the news he was about to deliver he didn't really even understand. And so he consulted his clipboard one more time, looking at some paperwork, and then he looked up and he looked at Karen, and then he turned to Karen's husband and he just says to him, "Sir, does your wife have any enemies?" It would turn out Karen was suffering from a severe case of mercury toxicity. Mercury is a naturally occurring metallic element that is poisonous to humans in all its forms. And Karen had so much mercury in her body, in fact she had 80 times the toxic threshold, that doctors believed this had to have been an intentional poisoning, that someone must have attacked Karen trying to kill her with mercury. But Karen's husband said, I don't think my wife has any enemies. And then when Karen ultimately woke up, she reiterated that sentiment, that she did not have any enemies. The doctors, who knew Karen was a chemist, they asked her, have you had any recent exposure to mercury? And through slurred and difficult to understand speech, Karen would say that she had. In fact, over the last 6 months leading up to this hospital visit, Karen had had lots of exposure to mercury because she was actually in charge of this huge $7 million research project that was looking to investigate the effects certain metals had on human health. And one of the metals she was studying was mercury. But Karen assured the doctor that anytime she handled any of these metals, she was always very, very cautious, especially when she handled mercury because she understood how hazardous it was. She said she always wore the proper protective equipment to make sure none of the substances made contact with her skin, and she worked under this big chemical hood, which is like a big vacuum, to ensure she didn't accidentally inhale any of the toxic fumes that came off of these metals. The doctor was totally stumped and went silent for a second, and then Karen at some point broke the silence by saying, well, there was one time I did have a spill with mercury, but it was totally meaningless, and I haven't thought about it until just now, only because we're trying to figure out what happened. She would go on to tell the doctor about an incident that occurred 5 months earlier. She had been working at her lab at the university where she was employed when she accidentally spilled 1 or 2 tiny droplets of mercury onto the top of her left hand near her thumb. Now, she was wearing all of the prescribed protective equipment, including latex gloves on her hand, and so when she saw these droplets on her hand, she wasn't concerned for her health, she just followed procedure. She stopped what she was doing, she wiped the droplets off, and then she left her workstation, she threw away the contaminated gloves, she thoroughly washed her hands, and then put new gloves on, and then just went back to work and didn't think much of it. The type of mercury that Karen had spilled on her hand was called dimethylmercury. This is not the same thing as the shiny silver liquid we see in old thermometers. That is a hazardous substance, but it's nothing compared to dimethylmercury. Dimethylmercury is a clear liquid that is considered to be one of the most toxic substances on the planet. After hearing this story from Karen, the doctor agreed that overall this did seem like a kind of meaningless event because she had followed all the proper procedures and those droplets had landed on her gloves, not on her skin. But since they had no other leads to operate on, he thought it would still be a good idea to test to see if dimethylmercury could penetrate through latex. And sure enough, after they ran some studies, they found it could. In fact, the latex gloves that all these scientists were told to wear when handling this particular substance, they did nothing. The dimethylmercury would penetrate through the latex in seconds. But even though they had just solved the mystery of how Karen got mercury toxicity in the first place, what no one could understand was why Karen was still suffering from the effects of mercury toxicity if her only exposure to it was 5 months earlier, just that one time. Typically, people who have mercury toxicity, they will get better as soon as the source of their toxicity is removed. Meaning, when the mercury goes away, they get better. And it's because the mercury kind of pools in their bloodstream and their body will naturally excrete it and they'll get better. But unfortunately for Karen, it would turn out dimethylmercury is a little bit different. It's far more lipophilic than other types of mercury. Lipophilic means a chemical substance is more likely to bind and mix with fat tissue in the body. And since blood is primarily made of water, when dimethylmercury enters the body, it does not settle in the bloodstream. Instead, it settles in organs that are made up of primarily fat. And once dimethylmercury is in your organs, it takes an exponentially longer amount of time for your body to excrete it, if it ever does. Sometimes you just die from the effects of mercury toxicity before your body can get rid of it. And in Karen's case, when she showed up to the hospital, it was already too late. Some of the dimethylmercury had already made its way up to her brain, which is an organ made up of 60% fat, and there it began to destroy her central nervous system. 3 weeks after being admitted to the hospital, Karen fell into a coma, and then shortly after, one of Karen's friends was in the hospital visiting her, and she saw a tear was coming down Karen's face. And so the friend turned to the doctor and said, is she in pain? Is that why she's crying? And the doctor said, no, it doesn't appear her brain is able to register pain anymore. Karen would unfortunately never wake up from her coma. She would pass away on June 8th, 1997, roughly 10 months after those little droplets of dimethylmercury landed on her latex glove. The next and final story of today's episode is called Unknown Unnatural Hazard. Before sunrise on August 22nd, 1986, a man named Ephraim Che woke up feeling groggy and confused. As he lay in his bed inside of his small mud brick house perched up on a cliff, he tried to remember what happened the night before. He didn't know why, but he knew, something happened last night. I gotta remember it. But as he lay there kind of jogging his memory, he felt like there were holes in his memory, like he couldn't quite piece together what had happened the day or night before. However, there was one thing he distinctly remembered about the night before, and that was at some point he had heard one really loud boom of thunder outside. And Ephraim, kind of somewhere in the back of his mind, had thought, oh, it's going to rain tonight, and maybe when I wake up it'll still be raining. And then Ephraim, no matter how hard he focused, he couldn't really remember how much time passed after hearing that booming sound and then getting in his bed the night before. But at some point, he remembered being in his bed and feeling kind of sick. And that was it. That was his whole memory of the night before. And so that morning, August 22nd, when Ephraim has suddenly woken up feeling confused, he rolled over and he looked out the window right nearby his bed, and he looked outside and he saw the sky was clear and the grass was totally dry. There was no indication that it had rained anytime recently. And so Ephraim is thinking to himself, something is definitely off here, but I just can't get my mind right. And so finally, Ephraim just sits up in his bed, he swings his legs out of his bed onto the ground, he stands up and practically falls over once he's on his feet. But he eventually gets himself back up, kind of steadies himself, and then he thinks, okay, I need to go check on my 4 kids and make sure they're okay. But the second Ephraim began to move in his house, it was like his body didn't obey his mind. Because moments later, instead of checking on his kids, Ephraim had wandered out his front door and was just standing out in front of his house, just kind of staring off into the distance, having no idea why he walked out there. The village where Ephraim lived was called Nyos, and Nyos is extremely rural. There's no electricity, there's no running water, and there's no paved roads for miles. The village is actually split into 2 parts. There's Upper Nyos and Lower Nyos. Ephraim lived in Upper Nyos, right near this big, beautiful lake called Lake Nyos, but the majority of villagers lived in Lower Nyos, which was below the lake. So that morning, after Ephraim kind of found himself standing outside of his hut for no reason, he began looking around in hopes that other people would be out and about in Upper Nyos, where he lived, so he could go talk to them and try to figure out what was wrong with him or, what was going on generally. But as he scanned around Upper Nyos, he saw there was not another soul anywhere. He was it. He was the only person walking around. So, without giving it much thought, Ephraim decided he would just start walking down towards Lower Nyos to try to talk to someone down there. And so he left his hut and he began walking down the hill that would take him to Lower Nyos. After Ephraim got about halfway down this hill, right when he was near Lake Nyos, he stopped because suddenly he became totally aware of the fact that the world was totally silent. Normally, the baboons in the nearby forest would be barking and insects would be humming and birds would be chirping, but now it was just completely, totally silent. Even the mosquitoes that were a totally annoying constant in Ephraim's life were gone. It was like the entire world had just shut down. And as Ephraim is looking around, wondering what is going on here, he hears off to his right, over near the lake, a woman shrieking at the top of her lungs. And so Ephraim whipped his head in the direction the screams were coming from, and he saw there was this woman about 100 feet away. She was a local, and she was looking right at Ephraim, and she was barely dressed, and she was ripping the rest of her clothes off, and she was just screaming. And so acting on instinct, Ephraim immediately turned and just started running towards this woman. And as he's bounding towards her, getting closer and closer, he's starting to notice there's these strange shapes on the ground kind of near this woman. But as he was staring at them, he just couldn't quite place what they were. But when he got about 20 feet away from this shrieking woman, he stopped again because he realized the shapes on the ground were this woman's entire family. They were all just laying on the ground as if they were sleeping. And near them was all of their cattle, also just laying on the ground as if they were sleeping. But as Ephraim stared at each of these people and each of these animals on the ground, he saw there was some blood around their noses and their mouths, and he realized no person who's sleeping would be that still. These people are all dead. These animals are all dead. And so standing there, Ephraim turned his attention from the bodies back to this woman who had dropped to her knees, and she was grabbing her father's arm and yanking on it and screaming for him to please wake up. But Ephraim could tell there was nothing she could do. Everyone was gone. And Ephraim knew somewhere deep down that, he's supposed to go over and help this woman or console her. But suddenly this wave of fear came over him, the combination of having no idea what's going on, his mind really wasn't working still, and now seeing all these dead people, it was like he just couldn't handle it. And so even though he felt terrible about this, Ephraim took one last look at this very distraught woman and her deceased family, and he turned and he ran away. And when he got back to the main trail, he continued downhill in the direction of Lower Nyos. The villagers in Lower Nyos lived in these tiny huts with tin roofs that were closely grouped together, and usually, even early in the morning, Lower Nyos was a very happy and lively place with kids running around and animals walking in the road and music playing. But as Ephraim came down the hill and was within earshot of Lower Nyos, it was deadly silent. And so with panic starting to rise inside of Ephraim, he began to run at full speed, hoping that when he turned the corner and looked down the main road of Lower Nyos, he would see the people he was hoping he would see. But when he turned the corner and looked down Main Street, all he saw were dead animals everywhere. They completely covered the streets, the sidewalk, everything. And so at this point, Ephraim was so desperate to see another person that he kept his eyes looking straight ahead so as not to look at all the dead animals, and just ran straight into Lower Nyos, and he turned towards the first hut he saw, and he ripped the door open and he stepped inside, and as soon as he did, he just stopped. Because on the ground right in front of him was a woman who was very clearly deceased, just laying in the middle of the floor. She had a bowl of corn right near her hand as if she had been eating and then just fell dead. And so Ephraim, he's staring at this dead woman, and then he looks up and he realizes the bedroom is right in eyesight, and he can see her family in their beds. And at first, Ephraim thought, oh, they're sleeping. But then as he continued to stare through the doorway into this room, he saw none of them were moving. Their chests were not going up and down from breathing. Her whole family, they were dead too. At this, Ephraim kind of stumbled backwards out of the hut, and then he turned around to face the road he had just been on with all the animals. And when he saw the road again, it was like a piece of his brain started working properly again, because he realized those weren't animal bodies. All those bodies he saw when he came in, those were people. Yes, there were some animals, but most of them were people. He could see people slumped on top of each other, kind of piled up in doorways. He saw one person who was on his motorcycle in the middle of the road, just slumped over his handlebars. And many of the bodies were either naked or partially clothed, with piles of clothing next to them, as if they had been trying to rip their clothes off as fast as they could, like the woman up at the lake had been doing. And as Ephraim looked around in horror, he also realized that there were no markings or cuts or wounds on any of these people. It was like they were just going about their lives when suddenly they died. And so without anything else to do, Ephraim just continued to walk in the direction he had come into the village, hoping that if he kept on going, he might run into someone who was alive. And so he begins walking down the road, he's stepping over bodies, he has no idea what to make of this, and then way down the road, up ahead, he sees there are two people coming towards him. There's a man and what looks like his son, and they're jogging down the road, stumbling over bodies, running towards Ephraim. And so Ephraim stops, expecting these people are going to stop and talk to him, But as these two people got closer, Ephraim saw both of them, the father and the son, their eyes were wide and they were looking straight ahead with kind of a distant 1,000-yard stare, and they didn't stop for a second for Ephraim. It was like they didn't even see him. They just kept on running down the road, past all the bodies. Ephraim didn't try to stop them. He just watched as they passed. And then at some point, they veered off the road and ran into the forest and disappeared. And it was at this moment that another part of Ephraim's brain seemed to kind of fit into place. Because as he watched this father and son disappear, he suddenly had this memory come flooding back into his mind. And it was a memory of when he was a kid and his grandfather told him a story. And the story was about Nyos villagers a long, long time ago who decided they wanted to cross Lake Nyos from one side to the other. And so their leader magically parted the waters of Lake Nyos, creating a walkway on the lake bed from one side to the other, and the villagers began to walk. And then, about halfway across, a mosquito landed on the leader's shoulder, and when he went to slap the mosquito, he lost control of the waters and they came crashing down and drowned all of them. Ephraim's grandfather told Ephraim that the ghosts of these drowned villagers now resided between these two big rocks located near Lower Nyos. And so growing up, Ephraim, along with many other people in this village, believed that because of these ghosts, Lower Nyos must be haunted. And in fact, that was actually why Ephraim built his house in Upper Nyos, to avoid these ghosts. And so now, as this memory of hearing this story from his grandfather has come flooding back to Ephraim, he thinks to himself, of course, all of this is the work of those ghosts. And so fearing he would be attacked next, Ephraim turned and just continued running down the road, dodging bodies as he went. And as he ran along, periodically he would stop at various tin huts and he would fling the door open in hopes he would find some survivors. But each time he went inside, everybody in there would be dead, lying in their beds or sitting in chairs or lying on the ground. But after running for quite a while, Ephraim turned to go into yet another hut, and right as he reached for the door opened on its own. And standing in front of him was the owner of this hut. His name was Joseph Naquain, and he was in much worse shape than Ephraim. The night before, Joseph had been inside of his hut when suddenly outside he heard that very loud booming sound that sounded like thunder to Ephraim. And then after hearing the sound, Joseph heard his daughter in her bed making this terrible snoring sound. And so instinctively, Joseph turned to walk over to his daughter to make sure she was okay, but he only got a few steps before he collapsed to the ground. He had woken up that morning with cuts all over his arms from where he fell, and he was also totally exhausted and very confused like Ephraim, and so he managed to drag himself over to his daughter's bed, and he pulled himself up onto her bed, and when he got up there, he realized his daughter was deceased. And so now Joseph has opened the door and he's looking out, and there's all these dead people everywhere, and Ephraim is looking back at him, and Joseph just can't process anything. He's just standing there in a total daze, and Ephraim, he wanted to say something, but no words could come out. And so he too just stood there looking at Joseph. And the two men just stood there right on the threshold of this hut, staring at each other, saying nothing for several minutes, until finally they both just extended their hands and shook silently. And then Ephraim turned around and ran back into the road. And so Joseph at first followed Ephraim kind of out of instinct, but very quickly he veered off from Ephraim, and Joseph went into his neighbor's hut to see if they were okay. But when he opened the door and went inside, he saw all of his neighbors were deceased. But Joseph, he barely reacted to this. It was like he was so numb to what was going on, he just couldn't process it. But after seeing all of his neighbors dead, somewhere deep down inside of his consciousness, Joseph knew he had to go find help. That was his mission. And so he left his neighbor's hut, he ran back to his own hut, he climbed onto his motorcycle, and he started to drive. It took Joseph a long time to drive to the next closest village, but when he got there were people, and they were all alive. And so Joseph tried to tell them what had happened in his village, But Joseph just had such a hard time putting his thoughts together that his sentences just didn't make sense. He was kind of incoherent. And then when he did make sense, the things he was talking about, an entire village just suddenly dying, sounded crazy. And so nobody at this other village took Joseph seriously. And so that day, nobody from this other village went to Nyos to see what was going on. But the next day, people from this other village did go to Nyos. And when they got there, it was exactly as Joseph had said. The whole village was dead. And as authorities would soon find out, it was not just Nyos that was affected by this tragic event. Several villages not far from Nyos had also suffered mass casualty events on the morning of August 22nd, 1986. And soon, news of these strange mass death events in West Africa were making the news all over the world. And so on August 25th, 3 days after this terrible event, an American scientist named Joseph Devine turned on his TV and saw the news coming out of West Africa. The newscasters were totally baffled about how this could have happened, and no one can figure out what killed these people. And Devine is just staring at his TV in shock. And then he turns, runs to his phone, and he calls his contact at the US government and told them, "You gotta send me to Nyos." And because his contact knew Devine's background, he immediately said, "Yes, I'll get you on a flight as soon as we can." Devine and his scientific partner, Haraldur Sigurdsson, arrived in Nyos 2 days later on August 27th. When they got there, they saw the military was burying the dead in these huge mass graves, and looking on were the few survivors of this event, like Joseph and Ephraim. Along with Ephraim's family, they also survived, as well as other villagers who had come to see what happened. And so as Devine and Sigurdsson kind of maneuver their way through this crowd of very solemn people, they heard them talking about what they thought happened to all these people. And the theories ranged from secret governmental experiments to invisible superweapons to even atomic explosions. Others, like Ephraim, believed this was paranormal, that those ghosts from the drowned villagers had attacked the village. But Devine and Sigurdsson were reasonably sure that none of those theories were correct. They felt like they did know what actually happened because they had actually witnessed a tragedy like this before, but on a much smaller scale. 2 years earlier, and 60 miles south of Nyos, in an area called Lake Manoon, 37 people suddenly dropped dead. And Devine and Sigurdsson had been sent out there to try to figure out what happened to these people, and after lots of experimentation, they came up with a theory that explained what happened, and they called it unknown unnatural hazard. They tried to warn people in the area that this could happen again, and in fact, Sigurdsson had written an entire scientific paper about this theory and submitted it to a prestigious science journal, but nobody took Devine or Sigurdsson seriously. What they were proposing sounded made up, it sounded preposterous. But now, in Nyos, it looked very much like their unknown, unnatural hazard had happened again. Devine and Sigurdsson would leave the group of people watching this mass burying take place, and they would make their way up the hill to Lake Nyos, where they would immediately get to work taking water samples from deep inside the lake. And after capping these samples, the lids began popping off. And that was the moment that Devine and Sigurdsson knew their unknown, unnatural hazard theory had to be correct. Lake Nyos is not your typical lake. It is a crater lake, which means it sits inside of a volcanic crater, which is a big, deep, bowl-like pit that was formed from a past volcanic explosion. And because of this volcanic activity, there is carbon dioxide in Lake Nyos. A lot of carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide, or CO2 for short, is an odorless, invisible gas that we actually breathe out when we exhale. Now, if you inhale a little bit of CO2, that won't hurt you. If you inhale a little bit more, like a medium amount of CO2, you could feel dizzy and nauseous, your skin will start to feel like it's on fire, you'll have rapid breathing. It'll be horrible, but you'll most likely survive if you stop breathing CO2. And if you breathe in a ton of CO2, you're dead. The CO2 in Lake Nyos had been trapped at the bottom of the lake for as long as anyone knew. But on the night of August 21st, 1986, something happened that caused that trapped gas to be released. Now remember, on that night, August 21st, Ephraim recalled hearing what he thought was thunder outside, and also Joseph would recall hearing a loud booming sound that night. Now, we don't know exactly what that sound was, but it's safe to say that that noise, whatever it was connected to releasing the gas. Maybe it was the sound of a rock slide and big rocks plummeted into the lake and hit the lake bottom and freed the gas that way. Or maybe it was just an actual volcanic eruption inside of the lake. Whatever it was, when the CO2 was freed, it bubbled to the top like it bubbled and popped off the lids of their sample tubes, and when it reached the top of the water, it kind of formed a cloud above the lake. Now, we can't see the cloud, but you can imagine a big cloud, and then this toxic CO2 cloud kind of rolled its way down the hill towards Lower Nyos and other villages in the area. And when this big toxic cloud began coming in contact with people, with animals, and insects, virtually all of them died. As for the few who survived, like Ephraim and his family and Joseph, they were left feeling horribly confused, disoriented, nauseous, totally dizzy from CO2 poisoning. But when they finally were able to get away from Nyos and breathe fresh air, the effects of CO2 poisoning wore off and they were okay. This deadly CO2 phenomenon was exactly what happened on a much smaller scale 2 years earlier at Lake Manoon. It was the unknown unnatural hazard that Devine and Sigurdsson had tried to warn people about. The official death toll of the Lake Nyos disaster was more than 1,700 people and more than 3,500 livestock, although exact numbers will likely never be known. Today, people have moved back into Upper and Lower Nyos, including Ephraim, despite the fact that authorities have said that lake is still very dangerous and another unknown unnatural hazard, aka a CO2 disaster, could absolutely happen again.
On July 4th, 1989, 24-year-old Patty Stallings stood on the porch of her home in Hillsboro, Missouri, which is the suburb of St. Louis. She and her husband, 27-year-old David, had recently purchased this house, which overlooked Lake Wawanoka. That night, they could actually see the local Independence Day fireworks show right from their front porch. However, instead of looking up at the fireworks, both of them were just admiring their 4-month-old son, Ryan, who cooed as Patty cradled him in her arms. A sense of gratitude washed over Patty as she locked eyes with her husband. She couldn't believe how much her life had changed in just a few short years. As a teenager, she'd lived on the streets, with nothing of her own and no one to protect her. In her early 20s, she had gotten a job at a convenience store, a 7-Eleven, hoping to turn her life around. But things hadn't really changed until 3 years ago, in 1986, when she had met her future husband David, who worked as a professional plate engraver. He and Patty had clicked right away, and they got married in 1988 and were soon able to purchase this dream home, the small lake house with white trim and a nice front porch. Because of her husband, Patty was the happiest she had ever been in her entire life. As the fireworks continued to illuminate the night sky, Patty looked back down at her baby's peaceful face tucked up against her chest. But then, out of nowhere, her baby, Ryan, vomited all over Patty's shirt, way more than how much babies usually spit up. But Patty wasn't too concerned. Ryan had suffered from digestive problems since he was just 2 weeks old, and his doctors had assured her as long as he was gaining weight, he was okay. And Ryan was hitting all of his weight benchmarks, so Patty trusted he would be okay. But still, when Patty went inside to get changed, and also to change the baby, she wanted to make sure Ryan didn't appear sick. He didn't seem fussy or uncomfortable, and he smiled and cooed at her as she changed him into a fresh onesie, and so Patty figured everything must still be fine. So she finished dressing her baby, then she changed her own clothes, and then the pair went back outside to enjoy the rest of the fireworks with David. 5 days later, Patty woke up in her large, sunny bedroom feeling unusually well rested. She rolled over in bed to find the other side was empty. David had already left for work. She checked the clock on her nightstand and saw that it was almost 9 a.m. She'd slept in longer than usual. She listened for the sounds of her son crying for breakfast, but the house was silent. But Patty didn't think much of it. She was actually thankful to have such a nice, quiet, slow morning for once. Patty made her way into the kitchen, she brewed a cup of coffee, and then sat down on the couch. She spent a moment enjoying the peace and quiet, but after a few minutes passed, she started feeling uneasy. It wasn't normal for her baby to sleep this late. And so Patty tiptoed into the nursery, and she found her son lying in his crib, but he wasn't asleep. His eyes were wide open in a glassy stare. His lips were pressed tightly shut, and his chest rose and fell way too fast, like he was having trouble catching his breath. Patty's stomach dropped. She'd never seen her son look so sick before. She lifted his limp body out of the crib, and almost immediately, Ryan began vomiting almost uncontrollably. Patty was so scared she began shaking. Still carrying her baby, she ran into the living room. She grabbed the phone, but she didn't call 911. She lived far from the hospital and knew that waiting for an ambulance would waste time Ryan probably didn't have. She knew it would be faster just to take him to the hospital herself. So she called the St. Louis Children's Hospital and told the operator she was on her way. "10 minutes later, Patty sped down the highway towards St. Louis. She wasn't familiar with the roads, and driving in the city made her nervous. And so as cars honked and swerved around her, she tried to look down at the paper map in her lap to read it, but it was really hard to do that and also drive. As Patty turned around to check her blind spot, she caught a glimpse of Ryan in his car seat. It looked like his chest was barely moving. Afraid her son was just going to stop breathing altogether, Patty turned back around and just began looking out ahead for any highway sign that might just tell her where to go. Right up ahead, she noticed a sign that had a big H on it right near an exit ramp, and Patty knew that meant there had to be a hospital close by. So she flipped on her blinker, she got off the freeway, and followed the hospital signs towards the emergency room. It wasn't until she pulled into the parking lot of that hospital that she realized it was not the St. Louis Children's Hospital that she had called. The sign on the building that she was at said Cardinal Glennon Children's Hospital. But really, it didn't matter to Patty. She was just happy to be somewhere with doctors who could help her son. So she turned off her car, she jumped out, and she opened up the back door, and she reached in, and Ryan's tiny body was just so limp in his car seat. Patty unstrapped him carefully and then picked him up and held him tight to her chest. She could barely hear his shallow breathing as she ran with him inside the emergency room. Once she was inside, Patty rushed to the check-in desk and explained what was going on. A young nurse arrived quickly and ushered her and her son into the pediatric intensive care unit. The nurse then took Ryan out of Patty's arms and brought him into an examination room. Patty followed, feeling totally helpless. As Patty walked into the room, she saw her son was already being hooked up to a nasal cannula, which is like a thin tube with two prongs that are inserted into the nose. When they turned it on, it sent oxygen into Ryan's lungs, helping him breathe. Within moments, Patty could see her son's chest was now rising and falling normally, and she was so relieved. As soon as the ER doctor confirmed that yes, Ryan was stable now, Patty asked a nurse to use the hospital phone. She needed to call her husband. Later that day, Patty and her husband David sat by Ryan's bedside, watching him breathe through the tube attached to his nose. After such a frantic morning and afternoon, Patty was totally exhausted, and David, who had left work early to be there, was also very tired. And so as the anxiety of the day began to fade away, because Ryan was very stable at this point, the parents began to nod off. But before they could fall asleep, an older man in a white coat entered the room. He had graying hair and a round, reddish face. He sat down next to the parents and introduced himself as Dr. Stevens, the hospital's chief of pediatrics. Patty couldn't read the doctor's expression. It was like he'd practiced keeping his face totally neutral, most likely so he could deliver any kind of news, good or bad, with some level of professional distance. Dr. Stevens told the parents that their son, Ryan, seemed like he was going to be okay, but he really wasn't sure what had caused their son's illness. He had ordered some blood tests, but it could take days to run them all, and Ryan needed to stay in the hospital until the results were in. Until then, there was really nothing Patty or David could do, and so Dr. Stevens suggested that they go ahead and actually nod off and try to get some rest. 3 days later, on July 12th, Dr. Stevens strode down the hospital hallway, followed closely by 2 men wearing black suits. The doctor was totally on edge. In his long career as a pediatrician, he'd seen a lot of shocking things, but nothing like this. Dr. Stevens eventually came to a stop outside of a room where he knew Patty and David were staying. Ryan was not in the room with them. This was a room just for the parents. Dr. Stevens turned around and told the 2 men in suits to please wait in the hall for a second so that he, the doctor, could go in first and speak to the couple. The 2 men in suits nodded and stayed put, and Dr. Stevens, he took a deep breath, turned around, and then knocked on the door, but then before waiting for an answer, he just opened it up and went inside. Patty and David were sitting on the bed inside the room, looking tired but also hopeful. Dr. Stevens immediately told them that he had good news. Their baby, Ryan, was going to be okay. Dr. Stevens watched relief wash over both parents, and then Patty asked the doctor, when could they see their son? Dr. Stevens paused. He knew what he was about to say next was going to start a very difficult conversation. He explained that Ryan's diagnosis, while not fatal, was still very serious and deeply concerning. According to lab reports, Ryan had high levels of ethylene glycol in his system, and ethylene glycol was one of the main ingredients in antifreeze. It was extremely toxic if consumed, and there was no way a baby of Ryan's age could ingest antifreeze on his own. He couldn't even crawl yet. Dr. Stevens paused to gauge Patty and David's reaction, looking for any signs of guilt or panic, but their faces were blank with confusion. So Dr. Stevens continued, being very careful to keep his tone detached as he made his meaning crystal clear. There is only one way Ryan could have antifreeze in his system, and that would be if someone deliberately fed it to him. In short, he was telling the parents that their child had been intentionally poisoned, and Patty and David were the main suspects. Dr. Stevens watched the parents closely as they finally registered what he was saying. Their eyes went wide and their mouths fell open. He half expected them to begin protesting, but they actually just didn't say anything at all. They just stood there, stunned. Then Dr. Stevens walked over to the door and rested his hand on the doorknob, and then he told the parents that, given the circumstances, he had contacted both the Missouri Division of Family Services and the police. Then Dr. Stevens opened the door to reveal the 2 men in suits. They were detectives with the St. Louis Police Department, and they were here to interview Patty and David. The little room fell silent as Dr. Stevens watched Patty and David stand up and follow the 2 detectives down the hallway towards 2 rooms where each parent would be interviewed separately. 9 days later, Patty stood at her son's bedside in the Cardinal Glennon Children's Hospital. Ryan smiled up at her with no breathing tubes in the way. He cooed and grabbed at the air. Patty wanted to reach down and pick him up, but she was too anxious. 2 nurses stood in the corner of the room like guards, watching her every move. When the detectives had interviewed her the previous week, they'd asked her a lot of invasive questions about her marriage and her baby. They kept repeating that either she or her husband must have poisoned Ryan. The whole thing just felt like some sick joke. Patty insisted she was innocent. She had no idea how her son ended up with antifreeze in his system, but she knew she and David were not to blame. The police did eventually let them go, and they'd spent every night at the hospital since then, but still, every time Patty left her room, she could feel the staff looking at her with intense suspicion. Patty turned and made eye contact with one of the nurses standing in the corner of the room. Patty asked if she could hold her baby. The nurse hesitated and then said, "Yes, you can." Patty reached down, but before she could pick Ryan up, Dr. Stevens came into the room. Patty instinctively pulled her arms back. She'd felt like she'd been caught doing something wrong, even though all she really wanted to do was just hold her baby. Dr. Stevens came over to Ryan's bedside and took a look at him. Patty knew her son had been improving, but she was still kind of surprised when Dr. Stevens said Ryan was healthy enough to leave the hospital. Patty broke into a huge smile at this news. She'd been so confused and anxious, but now her son was healthy again. The police hadn't arrested her and her husband. It sounded like everything was going to be okay. But then she saw the doctor's expression shift. He explained that Ryan was being released from the hospital, but he was not going home with Patty and David. The police investigation was still ongoing, and until they knew more, Dr. Stevens had to release Ryan into the custody of the state. Ryan was going to be placed in foster care. Patty was stunned and heartsick. She'd assumed once Ryan got better, they'd be able to move on. But now she realized this problem was going to be much bigger and go on much longer than she'd anticipated. But more than anything else, she was just worried about some stranger taking her baby home. She had no way of knowing if the foster family would actually take good care of him. Patty wanted to scream, but looking at Dr. Stevens' face, she knew it wouldn't make any difference. So she turned away from the doctor and sat down next to Ryan's hospital bed, saying she wouldn't leave his side until she absolutely had to. 6 weeks later, Patty, David, and David's parents arrived at a state-sponsored childcare facility in St. Louis for a visit with baby Ryan. Ever since they'd left the hospital, Patty and her husband had been attending these meetings every Thursday. Patty was excited to see her son, but she was frustrated that the police investigation still was not over. As long as the police were still looking into Ryan's case, she couldn't bring him home. And so the only time she got with her son were these 1-hour-long meetings just once per week. Ryan's foster parents would drop him off at the childcare facility and then pick him up as soon as Patty and David left. To Patty, the whole situation felt ludicrous and backwards, but at the same time, she would much rather spend just an hour with her son each week than no time at all. Patty, David, and David's parents entered the building, and right away, a social worker met them at the door, and she was holding Ryan. Patty's heart leapt when she saw her son. He looked healthy and he smiled as soon as he saw her. Patty reached out and took him from the social worker's arms and carried him down the hallway into a small playroom. The social worker followed the family inside to supervise their visit. For the next hour, Patty, David, and David's parents showered baby Ryan with attention. For Patty, it was bittersweet. They should have been doing these things at their home, not in some facility. When the hour was almost up, David's parents got up to leave. David offered to walk them to their car, and the social worker went along too. They all left the room, and Patty was suddenly alone with her son for the first time in 6 weeks. Suddenly, Ryan began crying. Patty knew he must be hungry, and his foster parents had left a bag for him, so she checked inside of it and found a bottle of formula. She took it out, cradled Ryan in her arms, and began feeding it to him. Patty gazed down at her son, who looked totally content drinking out of his bottle. She held on to hope that she would have him back home soon, and this entire situation would just be over. 3 days after the visit, Patty and David were sitting on their porch looking out across the lake when a police cruiser pulled up in front of their house. 2 officers stepped out, walked up, and announced that they had a warrant. They were there to search their home. Patty could see that her husband was about to protest, but she nudged him, basically saying, "Be quiet, let this happen." At this point, she didn't care what the police did, and the sooner they finished their investigation, the sooner they would realize the parents had done nothing and Ryan could come home. And so while the detectives searched their house, Patty and David just sat together on the porch, not really saying anything. There wasn't anything to say. They both just wanted this to be over. After about an hour, Patty heard the officer's footsteps coming towards the front door. She turned to look at them and saw that they were carrying a large paper bag with the word evidence printed on the front. Before Patty could even say anything, they told her she was under arrest. She stared at them, frozen in shock. Beside her, David stood up out of his chair. He told the officers they can't be serious. But the detectives assured him they were. They said there were a lot of things that Patty and David didn't know. That very morning, Ryan's foster parents had to take him to the Cardinal Glennon Children's Hospital. Once again, he was suffering from symptoms of antifreeze poisoning. When police spoke to his foster parents, they learned that Patty had been left alone with him during their last visit, and she had fed him a bottle of formula. Forensic analysts tested the bottle, and found traces of antifreeze inside. Plus, the detectives had just discovered an open gallon-sized jug of antifreeze in Patty and David's basement. Patty was floored. She couldn't even process what they'd said about Ryan's bottle and the antifreeze in their basement. She was just too focused on the fact that her baby was sick again and back at the hospital. The police pulled Patty out of her seat and put handcuffs on her wrists. She heard them say she was being charged with assault with a deadly weapon. As they led her towards the police car, she craned her neck backwards and called out to her husband. She begged him to drive up to the hospital. One of them had to be with their son. "4 days after his wife was arrested, David shifted in his chair in the waiting room of the Cardinal Glennon Children's Hospital. For the past 4 days, he'd been living in his own private hell. He couldn't sleep, he barely ate. He could only think about 2 things: his wife being locked up in a jail cell, and his son sick in the hospital. And in fact, Ryan's condition was much worse this time than it was the last time. This time, he was not getting better, and in fact, the doctors had placed him on life support. A few minutes later, Dr. Stevens walked into the room. The doctor's face, which was usually professional and emotionless, was now drawn. David asked what was going on, and Dr. Stevens couldn't help himself, and he just let out this long sigh. Then the doctor explained that despite everything the hospital had tried, his baby Ryan was not getting better. The poison had damaged his organs beyond repair, and there was no chance he would recover. Dr. Stevens told David that if he was religious, that he should think about contacting a minister to baptize his baby Ryan before it was too late. The little boy was very likely not going to make it. These words hit David like a punch. The grief was so immediately overwhelming that he could physically feel it in his chest. But the worst part was, he still didn't understand how this was even happening. David could barely speak, but he managed to whisper out that his wife really needed to be here. Then David just ran to the waiting room payphone, and after calling the jail where Patty was being held, and then also the local courthouse, David ended up talking to the judge in charge of Patty's case. And David begged the judge to please release his wife so she could at least come to the hospital and be with her child during his final moments. David assumed the judge would have at least some sympathy for their situation, so he was surprised when, without the slightest hesitation, the judge said no. He called Patty a baby killer and refused to let her anywhere near her son. At this point, David's grief turned into rage. He slammed the phone down and crumpled into his chair. In the span of only 2 months, his perfect life had fallen apart. But despite what the police and the judge said, he knew Patty was innocent. She adored their son. There had to be a better explanation for what was going on. David took a deep, shuddering breath and then turned to see Dr. Stevens standing there. In a soft voice, the doctor said they needed David's permission to disconnect Ryan from his life support machine. David asked if there was absolutely anything else they could try, but Dr. Stevens just shook his head and said no. And so, with no other options, David did give his permission. That same afternoon, David went into Ryan's room in the intensive care unit, and he choked back tears as a minister baptized his son. And then at around 5 p.m. on September 7th, 1989, David held Ryan as the doctors turned off his life support. David would sit there cradling his baby until his baby slowly passed away. A few hours later, David had to make one of the most difficult phone calls of his entire life. He had to call Patty in jail to tell her that her son was dead. When Patty heard the news, it was like the whole world just faded away. All she could hear was David's voice, explaining how he'd tried to convince the judge to let her come to the hospital, but he'd refused. David swore he'd done everything he could. He was scraping up money from relatives to hire a good lawyer. He promised he would get her out of jail as soon as he could. And then, for at least a full minute, Patty and David just stayed on the phone saying nothing to each other. As the white cinderblock walls of the jail's call center came back into focus, Patty saw the guard tap his wrist, letting her know her time was up. Patty told David she had to go, and then she hung up the phone and followed the guard out of the room, feeling totally numb. The next morning, Patty awoke to see a gruff-looking police deputy standing right outside the bars of her cell. He was there to give her even more bad news. Because her son had passed away, her charges were now being upgraded. In addition to assault with a deadly weapon, she was now being accused of first-degree murder. Patty grabbed a pillow and put it over her face. She felt like she'd been dragged into an alternate universe. She just couldn't understand how any of this could be real. The following month, in October, Patty sat on a plastic chair inside of the jail doctor's office. Across from her was a young physician who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else in the world right now. And frankly, Patty felt the same way. She told the doctor she'd been feeling overwhelmed. Her hair was falling out, she was gaining weight, and she wasn't menstruating. At first, she just assumed that the stress of this horrible situation she was in was making her physically sick. But now, she was beginning to think it actually might be more than that. The doctor did not seem very sympathetic, but he did run a few tests, including collecting blood and urine samples. And while he waited for test results, she went back to her cell. A few hours later, the doctor came by to deliver the news. It turned out Patty was pregnant. 4 months later, in February of 1990, Patty gripped the sides of her hospital bed, her knuckles turning white from the pain of her latest contraction. When she'd gone into labor, she was transferred from the jail to a nearby emergency room. Patty was in a lot of pain from all the contractions, but mostly she was just feeling frustrated and angry because here she was, giving birth to her second child, and her husband was not even allowed to be there. And also, on top of that, she was grieving the loss of her first child. Patty could hear the labor and delivery nurse instructing her to push, and so Patty dug her fingers into the mattress and squeezed her eyes shut, and she felt like her body was going to rip open, and then suddenly she heard the sound of her baby crying. The nurse lifted up the newborn, and with a smile, she announced that it was a boy. Patty softened her grip on the bed. Still out of breath, she said that she and her husband had already decided on a name. David Jr., or DJ for short. Patty reached out for her child, and the nurse handed the baby over to her, and Patty held her newborn son tight against her chest. But her joy only lasted a few moments, because before long, the nurse gave Patty a very sympathetic expression, and then reached in and grabbed DJ, and then took DJ out of the room. Patty had known this was going to happen. She'd been told that, just like Ryan, DJ would be placed directly into state custody. Now she hadn't just lost one child, she'd lost two. Patty rolled over in her bed, sobbing. 2 weeks after giving birth to DJ, Patty sat in the jail's call center with a phone pressed against her ear. David had called to talk to her, and his voice was tight with concern. He said it was about DJ. Patty didn't think she could handle any more bad news, but she asked her husband, what was wrong, and he said DJ's foster parents had had to take him to the St. Louis Children's Hospital that morning. Doctors said he was going to be okay, but he was extremely sick. At the thought of her youngest son being in the hospital, just like Ryan had been, Patty felt a knot rise in her throat. She asked David what kind of symptoms DJ had and if the doctors had diagnosed him with anything specific. And as David started listing off all of DJ's issues, Patty had an idea. She told her husband she had to go. She needed to call her lawyer before her phone time was up. David had managed to collect enough money from his family to hire an attorney for Patty. Since then, she and this lawyer had been preparing for her upcoming murder trial. And in her experience so far, the lawyer tended to be very busy and somewhat difficult to reach. Patty dialed her attorney's number. The phone rang so long she was worried he wouldn't answer, but finally he did pick up. But he sounded breathless and overwhelmed as usual. Patty knew this lawyer had a lot of cases to deal with, but for now, she really needed him to listen. Patty had a theory that she thought would prove her innocence, that she never gave Ryan antifreeze. The lawyer listened to this theory and then afterwards promised to do whatever he could. Patty thanked him and then hung up the phone. When she stood up, Patty actually felt pretty good. She was actually looking forward to her trial, which was scheduled for early 1991. It would be her chance to prove her innocence, bring DJ home, and put this horrible series of events in the past. About a year later, in early 1991, so January 31st, David sat in a quiet courtroom gallery, anxiously watching as 12 jurors re-entered the room. After 3 days of trial and 10 hours of deliberation, the jurors had finally reached a verdict on whether or not Patty was guilty of murdering her son Ryan. David tried to stay positive, but honestly, he did not feel very optimistic. The prosecution had been led by a tall, imposing man named George McElroy. He was the lead prosecutor in Jefferson County, Missouri, and he had presented an overwhelming amount of evidence against Patty. The prosecution's witnesses had testified that antifreeze had been found in Ryan's blood twice. The results were confirmed by 2 different laboratories using 2 different diagnostic methods. Plus, analysts had found traces of ethylene glycol in Ryan's bottle, and also an open container of antifreeze inside of David and Patty's house. All through the trial, David had anxiously waited for Patty's lawyer to present Patty's theory, the one she thought could prove her innocence. The lawyer had tried to make an argument for it, but he didn't call an expert witness to testify. So the judge wouldn't allow it into evidence, and the jury wasn't allowed to consider Patty's theory. David had been furious. It wasn't easy to pay for this lawyer, and now he felt like the lawyer had kind of failed and Patty's defense had been a total disaster. But there was nothing David could do now. The jurors sat down in the courtroom, and the jury foreman approached a microphone. David tapped his foot anxiously as he saw his wife at the front of the room, standing up, getting ready to hear what this foreperson had to say. Then David heard the foreman's voice through the courthouse speakers. But as the foreman read the verdict, it was like David's brain couldn't process what he was hearing. The jury had found Patty guilty of first-degree murder. After the verdict was read, David saw Patty collapse back into her chair. He couldn't see her face from his seat. All he saw were 2 policemen immediately handcuffing her and leading her out of the courtroom. David dropped his head into his hands, feeling a mixture of fury and despair. No matter what the prosecution had said, David did not have a shred of doubt about his wife's innocence. A week later, David was at home when he received a call from Patty's attorney. He was calling about Patty's sentence. She had just been sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. David was crushed. He hung up the phone and started pacing back and forth across his living room, trying to think of some way he could fix this, but he just couldn't think of anything. 4 months after Patty's trial, in May of 1991, David sat in his living room alone. He looked out the window that faced their front yard, and he remembered that night, almost 2 years ago, when he and his wife were holding Ryan and watching the fireworks. Patty said she couldn't believe how much her life had changed since they had met, and David couldn't believe how much more it had changed since then. Their first child had died, their second child, DJ, was still living with a foster family, and just like when Ryan was in foster care, David was only allowed to visit DJ once a week for 1 hour. But David still hoped he could find a way to bring his family back together. David picked up the remote and turned on the TV and changed the channel to NBC. In just a few minutes, the program he was waiting for would come on. He had promised himself he would find a way to make things right again. Ever since Patty's verdict, he'd been working to get as much publicity as possible. He'd even convinced the producers of a hugely successful television show to cover Patty's story. And as the clock hit 8 p.m., the opening credits of Unsolved Mysteries, the TV show, began. David saw his wife's face on the television, followed by pictures of baby Ryan. The narrator began their story, and David leaned back in his chair. He'd done everything he could. Now he just had to hope for the best. At the same time this show was playing, across town, a geneticist and pediatrician named Dr. William Sly sat at home in his easy chair watching the same Unsolved Mysteries broadcast. As he saw pictures of baby Ryan and listened to interviews with Patty, the doctor found himself totally hooked into this story. He also thought he might be able to help David and Patty. Dr. Sly was the chairman of St. Louis University's Department of Biochemistry. When he heard Patty explain her theory of why she was innocent on this show, the same theory her lawyer did not present at her trial, Dr. Sly thought it made sense. And if Patty's theory really was true, then Patty really had been wrongly convicted. The next morning, when Dr. Sly arrived at work at his university laboratory, he pulled one of his colleagues aside, Dr. James Shoemaker, to tell him about Patty's theory. But when Dr. Shoemaker heard Patty's name, he stopped in his tracks. He said he'd heard about the case over a year ago, in April of 1990. He also thought Patty's theory sounded viable, so he'd reached out to one of the laboratories that tested Ryan's blood. He'd requested copies of all their lab reports, as well as any samples of Ryan's blood that they still had on hand. Back then, Dr. Shoemaker had done his own analysis, and his results didn't exactly match the ones that one of the laboratories that tested Ryan's blood had come up with. At the time, Dr. Shoemaker didn't know what to do with this information, but he still had all the paperwork in his office. Dr. Sly's heartbeat quickened. He told his colleague he needed to see those lab results right now. The two doctors raced down the hallway to Dr. Shoemaker's office. Dr. Sly anxiously looked on as his colleague rifled through a stack of papers on his desk. Dr. Shoemaker grabbed a few sheets and held them out. Dr. Sly picked up the documents and started scanning through them. And as he compared the original lab results with Dr. Shoemaker's analysis, Dr. Sly's jaw dropped. He asked Dr. Shoemaker for a piece of paper and a pen. He needed to write a letter to the county prosecutor. 4 months later, in September of 1991, County Prosecutor George McElroy stood in front of a huge crowd of reporters and a cameraman. He looked to his right and he saw Patty and David standing beside them. Both of them had totally stoic expressions on their faces. Prosecutor McElroy straightened his jacket nervously. This was the most important and most embarrassing press conference of his career. He leaned close to the microphone and announced that he'd done something unprecedented. He had asked the county circuit judge to dismiss the murder charges against Patty Stallings. He said after reading Dr. Sly's letter and consulting with another independent medical expert, he was finally convinced of Patty's theory. She'd been right all along. Baby Ryan didn't die from antifreeze poisoning. For over 2 years, Patty had been accused of poisoning her son, but she had never hurt him. Nobody had. In reality, Ryan had died from a rare genetic disorder called methylmalonic acidemia, or MMA for short, which caused his own body to produce a deadly chemical that was nearly identical to antifreeze. People with MMA can't fully digest food containing certain proteins and fats, many of which are in breast milk and baby formula. When these nutrients are not properly processed, they break down and turn into poison in the body. This causes vomiting, lethargy, trouble breathing, and organ damage. Patty had told her lawyer that she believed Ryan could have this disorder because his little brother DJ had it too. When DJ had fallen ill, his symptoms were the exact same as Ryan's, but instead of finding antifreeze in his blood, DJ's doctors had found a toxic substance called propionic acid. Propionic acid is often a telltale sign of MMA. It's also almost chemically identical to ethylene glycol, which is the poison found in antifreeze. The molecules are only different by a few carbon atoms, and so the two are easily mistaken for each other. When Dr. Sly saw Ryan's case on Unsolved Mysteries and then looked over the baby's lab results, this was the tiny discrepancy he found. The substance that analysts thought was ethylene glycol was actually propionic acid. Tragically, if Ryan had been treated at St. Louis Children's Hospital, where DJ had been correctly diagnosed and Patty was trying to take Ryan when he first got sick, all of this could have been avoided. Instead, the analysts at Cardinal Glennon and the other labs that tested Ryan's blood had unfortunately misidentified this naturally occurring substance as antifreeze, and their incorrect findings had been used to send Patty, an innocent woman, to prison for life. It is worth noting that the mix-up in going to the wrong hospital would not have necessarily saved Ryan because MMA has an extremely high mortality rate and long-term survival is not very likely. As prosecutor George McElroy stood before the crowd of reporters, he admitted he'd been wrong and then he personally apologized to Patty and David. He said even though their suffering could not be undone, he would make sure Patty was fully exonerated and she would get to bring her surviving son, DJ, back home. Patty and David filed lawsuits against the Cardinal Glennon Children's Hospital, the diagnostic labs who'd misdiagnosed Ryan, and 3 different physicians. In 1993, they received an out-of-court settlement for an undisclosed amount. Their surviving son, DJ, battled the same genetic disorder that killed his brother, and unfortunately, it took his life too in 2013, when he was just 23 years old. From Ballen's Studios and Wondery, this is MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, hosted by me, Mr. Ballen. A quick note about our stories: we use aliases sometimes because we don't know the names of the real people in the story. And also, in most cases, we can't know exactly what was said, but everything is based on a lot of research. And a reminder, the content in this episode is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. This episode was written by Karis Allen Pash Cooper. Our editor is Heather Dundas. Sound design is by Ryan Potesta. Our coordinating producer is Taylor Sniffen, and our managing producer is Sophia Martins. Our senior producer is Alex Benedon. Our associate producers and researchers are Sarah Vitak and Tasia Palakonda. Fact-checking was done by Sheila Patterson. For Ballen Studios, our head of production is Zach Levitt. Script editing